On a cold March evening in 2023, the quiet of a Chicago neighborhood was shattered by the sound of 11 gunshots. What unfolded next would shake a family, a community, and even the thin blue line of law enforcement itself. A man lay dead on the floor, and standing over him was his son, Bernard Richardson, a 30-year-old Chicago police officer. This isn't a plot from a crime thriller or the opening of a mystery novel. This is real life. Bernard, a man sworn to protect and serve, had just made a decision that would not only change his life forever, but would ignite a firestorm of questions about morality, justice, and the lengths a parent will go to protect their child. Why did this happen? The answer is as horrifying as it is heartbreaking. Bernard's father, Bruce Richardson, had been caught in the act of assaulting Bernard's 10-year-old daughter, Danita. Danita, a child already facing the challenges of living with a disability, became the victim of an unspeakable act, one that no parent ever wants to imagine, let alone witness. Bernard walked in on a nightmare, a moment that would push any parent to their breaking point. In that instant, Bernard was not just a police officer, he was a father, consumed by rage and heartbreak. And in that moment, he chose action over restraint. What drives a man to take the law into his own hands, especially someone trained to uphold it? Was this a moment of justice served, a father protecting his daughter at all costs, or a crime of passion, fueled by emotions too overwhelming to control? These are the questions that now haunt Bernard, his family, and the community watching this tragedy unfold. For Bernard, this wasn't just about the betrayal of trust by his own father. It wasn't just about the broken family ties or the violence. It was about Danita, a little girl who should have been safe, loved, and protected by her family. The betrayal wasn't just Bernard's to bear, it was Danita's reality, and her safety was paramount in his mind. But once the gunshots rang out and Bruce Richardson lay dead, Bernard's life was forever changed. The legal system doesn't make room for emotions, even in moments as raw and human as this. Bernard now faces a murder charge, a charge that leaves the community torn. Some see him as a hero, a father who did what any parent would do to protect their child. Others see him as a man who let his emotions take control, abandoning his duty as a law enforcement officer. How does the justice system weigh such a case? How does a community move forward when the lines between right and wrong blur so deeply? And most importantly, how does Danita heal from the trauma of not only the assault, but the tragic loss that followed? Before we dive deeper into the details of this heartbreaking and complex story, we invite you to join the conversation. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to bring stories like this to light, stories of pain, love, and the difficult decisions people face. Thank you for being part of this community. Bernard Richardson, a 30-year-old Chicago police officer, had always been known for his commitment to his work. He had joined the force straight out of high school, driven by a sense of duty to protect and serve his community. Over the course of his 7-year career, he had earned a reputation as a dependable officer, someone who could always be counted on when things got tough. He was well liked by his colleagues, respected by his superiors, and trusted by the people he served. His dedication to the job was unquestionable. But on the evening of March 15, 2023, Bernard's life would take a turn that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Bernard wasn't just a cop, he was also a father. His daughter Danita was 10 years old and had Down syndrome. She was the light of his life. Being a single father was never easy, but Bernard had always been committed to providing for her and ensuring she had the best possible life. Despite the challenges that came with raising a child with special needs, Bernard never once let his love for her waver. He would do anything to protect her, and that deep sense of responsibility shaped everything he did. On the evening of March 15th, Bernard had finished his shift early and decided to head over to his father's house to pick up Danita. His father, Bruce Richardson, a 62-year-old retired Marine, had always been a constant presence in his life. Bruce was a tough, stoic man who had taught Bernard many of the values he held dear: honor, loyalty, and a sense of duty. They had always had a complicated but loving relationship, and Bruce had been more than willing to take care of Danita while Bernard worked. As Bernard drove through the quiet Chicago streets, he thought about how his life had changed in the past few years. He was still adjusting to being a single father after his wife had left him when Danita was just a baby. His work with the police department often kept him away from home, but he always made time for Danita, even if it meant sacrificing his personal life. Bernard felt a sense of guilt every time he had to leave her, but he tried to remind himself that he was doing this for her. He was working to provide her a stable life and a future. Although he worked long hours, he always made sure that his daughter had what she needed. That night, he was excited to see her. Danita was staying at Bruce's house, as she often did, and Bernard couldn't wait to pick her up and take her home. It was supposed to be a simple night, a quick stop at his father's house, a hug from Danita, and then a relaxing evening at home. But as Bernard arrived at the house, something felt wrong. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The porch light, something that Bruce always made sure to turn on, was off. Bernard immediately felt a sense of unease. His father was never one to forget small details like that. It was a subtle change, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in Bernard's mind. He pulled his car into the driveway and parked, his instincts on high alert. As Bernard walked up to the front door, he called out for his father and Danita, but there was no response. The house seemed still, as if it were empty. Bernard paused for a moment, standing in the entryway. The silence was unsettling, and he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had been in that house 1,000 times, and yet tonight it felt foreign, as though something was wrong. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everything looked normal at first glance. Bruce's old military memorabilia still adorned the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. But something was off. Bernard made his way through the house, his steps slow and deliberate, as he called for his father again. This time he thought he heard something like faint whimpers, almost too soft to be heard over the beating of his heart. Bernard froze. The sounds were coming from the guest bedroom. His instincts screamed at him to hurry, to get to Danita, but his body felt frozen in place for a moment. He tried to shake off the feeling that something terrible was unfolding behind that door. He walked toward the guest bedroom, each step heavier than the last, until he reached the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see into the room. And then Bernard saw it. Inside the room, Bruce was standing over Danita. His pants were down, and his granddaughter was visibly distressed, lying on the bed, her face a mixture of confusion and fear. The sight of it was enough to shatter Bernard's world in an instant. He couldn't process it, couldn't fully comprehend what he was seeing. His father, the man who had been his protector, his mentor, was standing over his daughter in the most unimaginable way. For a brief moment, Bernard's mind went blank. His father had always been a pillar of strength, a man who had fought in wars and raised Bernard with tough love. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Was this a mistake? Could his mind be playing tricks on him? But the look on Danita's face was enough to pierce through any doubt he had. She was terrified, and that was all Bernard needed to see. Without thinking, Without any time to process what was happening, Bernard reached for his service weapon. He had always been trained to act quickly in dangerous situations, but nothing had ever prepared him for this moment. His hand shook as he drew his gun, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. But there was no time to hesitate. This wasn't just a criminal. This was his father, the man who had helped raise him, and now he was a predator standing over his own granddaughter. Bernard had always known his duty as a cop, but in that moment, his duty as a father came first. Without a second thought, Bernard pulled the trigger. 11 shots rang out in the room, echoing through the house like a thunderclap. The sound was deafening. Each shot was a final punctuation to the nightmare unfolding before him. Bernard's father, the man who had once been his role model, collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Bruce Richardson was dead. In the aftermath, Bernard stood over his father's body, staring at the man he had once looked up to, now lying in a pool of his own blood. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, confusion, grief, and rage. But there was no time to think. Bernard turned to his daughter, who was still on the bed, trembling with fear. He rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms, trying to comfort her as best as he could in that moment of chaos. When the police arrived, Bernard was sitting on the floor beside Danita. His gun was placed calmly on the ground next to him, as if he had already processed what had happened. His demeanor was unsettlingly calm, but inside, his mind was reeling. He didn't even look up as the officers entered the room. They didn't need to ask any questions. Bernard's words were simple, direct, and filled with a grief that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "He touched my daughter." The emergency responders arrived on the scene, but there was nothing they could do for Bruce. He was already dead, the result of 11 gunshots that had torn through his body. The investigation began immediately, and the authorities quickly arrested Bernard without resistance. But questions began to surface. Was this a father protecting his daughter, or was it something more complicated? Was Bernard justified in his actions? Was this an act of self-defense, or did he let his emotions override his judgment? The questions mounted, and soon the case would become a national sensation. The public divided into two camps: those who believed Bernard was a hero, a man who had done what any father would do to protect his child, and those who believed he had taken the law into his own hands, acting in a moment of rage without regard for the consequences. The investigation had only just begun, but one thing was clear: the story of Bernard Richardson and his father would not be easily understood. The truth, as always, was far more complex than it seemed. This story has raised a question of justice, morality, and how far a parent will go to protect their child. Bernard Richardson may have been sentenced to 15 years in prison, but the emotional scars from that night will last far longer. The question remains: could this tragedy have been avoided? Or, in a moment of intense love and desperation, did Bernard do what any of us might have done if we found ourselves in his shoes? We want to hear your thoughts. Was Bernard's reaction a father's desperate need to protect his child, or was it a crime driven by rage? Was justice served, or was the punishment too harsh given the circumstances? If you've been moved by this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'll be back with more stories that dive deep into the complexities of crime and justice.